What's going on there, YouTube, and welcome back to another comic book video. Okay, so we're going to sit down and cover Days of Future Present, the next crossover that I have been talking about doing on my channel for a while. And guys, we are here. Now, this was a 4-part story arc that took place in 4 different annuals. Fantastic Four Annual number 23, X-Factor Annual number 5, New Mutants Annual number 6, and X-Men Annual number 14. All 4 annuals tell a story about one character coming from a supposed future and causing a lot of problems for our heroes. And that would be Franklin Richards. Yes, you heard that right. We are going to see Franklin Richards go up against X-Factor, the New Mutants, X-Men, and the Fantastic Four. But at the same time, we are also introducing a new character from the supposed future that Franklin Richards come. Now, this is actually a sequel to Days of Future Past, which of course showed us a dark future where the mutants had lost, the superheroes had lost. Matter of fact, all of North America is being controlled by the Sentinels, and most of the X-Men are dead. Most of the heroes are dead, and if you are a mutant, you are possibly dead or put inside a camp. But this storyline right here is a sequel to that story, and you'll see what I mean as we go through today's video. But the opening chapter for this crossover takes place in Fantastic Four Annual number 23. Now, the opening pages of this book, we pick up with the Fantastic Four heading back home to their base, except something is wrong. You see, around this time in Marvel Comics, the Fantastic Four was staying in a building called 4 Freedom Plaza because the Baxter building was actually shot up into space by Dr. Doom a few years back. And so 4 Freedom Plaza was their current base. But when our heroes come back home, their new home is no longer there. The Baxter building has returned. But get this, the public, the people who are just riding their bikes, walking around, or in their cars, they're acting completely normal. They're acting like the Baxter building had never left at all. And so you have our heroes wondering, what in the world is going on? Where is their old home? And so you have Reed and the rest of the team go inside to see what in the world is going on here. And so once you have our heroes go inside the actual building, they see all these people who used to work in the Baxter building. But here's the problem though. These people, they seem like they haven't aged since the Baxter building was shot up into space, which means that these people most likely are not actually real. Matter of fact, you have Reed said one of the guys had retired a while back. When I see him now, he looks the same as he did before he had retired years ago. Now you have our hero decide to go inside the elevator to go up to their part of the building, except when they do, all the different traps they used to have in the Baxter building are now here again in this new version of it and currently attacking our heroes. Now you do have our heroes use their abilities to get rid of all those different traps, and you have Reed being able to shut down the rest that could most likely activate. But once they're able to reach the main part of their home in the Baxter building, well, everything looks the same as it did before it was shot into space. And so you have our heroes wondering, what in the world is going on here? How is this even possible? How in the world did the Baxter building come back technically to life? Except while you have our heroes just walking around this place, they're then confronted by, well, themselves, the Fantastic Four. Now, I should also mention that around this time in Marvel Comics, the Fantastic Four really was the Fantastic Five. You had Reed Richards, you had the Human Torch, you had Susan, but you also had the Thing and She-Thing as well. Or really, she was calling herself Miss Marvel again. You see, She-Thing is Sharon Ventura. She was a Miss Marvel character, but then she went through some cosmic rays, which then changed her over to a She-Thing. Now, she used the code name Miss Marvel again around this point in Marvel Comics. Now, when it comes to Ben Grimm, he was just a regular looking dude. But then you have our heroes being confronted by past versions of themselves. And of course, it does lead into a battle, except our heroes, the original Fantastic Four, they actually lose to their past selves. But now you have Reed say, you know what? This is the perfect time to figure out what in the world is going on here. Now, when it comes to the past Reed, he begins to run some different tests on our Fantastic Four to kind of figure out what exactly is going on here. Now, with those tests, he was able to come find out that, well, both groups are literally the same people, the same Reed, the same Johnny, the same Ben Grimm, the same Susan Storm. And so you have the past Reed say, okay, you know what? These guys must have come from the future, or most likely an alternate timeline. But you have our Reed say, get this, you guys came from the past into our time. Now you didn't have both groups begin to compare notes with one another to see how they are different from one another. And then it all comes down to Franklin. And you have our Reed say, look, you don't even have a Franklin Richards. But the past Fantastic Four, they said, no, we do have a Franklin Richards. And he walks into the room. But here's the thing though, he's a grown man. Now, when it comes to the Fantastic Four, they believe that this Franklin Richards powers work very similar to their Franklin Richard powers. And so they tell him, listen, we believe that you had changed reality in our time. But the question is why? And where did you come from? Now, this adult Franklin, he begins to freak out. And the reason why? Because he feels like our Fantastic Four are in the wrong, that they should not be here, that the ones he had created around him are the real versions of the Fantastic Four, his parents. But then after freaking out, he just disappears. He flies away. But once he leaves, the Baxter building turns back into for Freedom Plaza, the base the team was currently using. But you have our heroes wondering what they should do next when it comes to this adult version of Franklin Richards. But now we have to jump over to the base of Excalibur. Now, Excalibur was one of the many X-Men teams around this time in Marvel Comics. But when it comes to Rachel Summers, she's talking to her team member, Megan. Now, when it comes to Rachel Summers, she is going to be really important for this storyline because she came from the Days of Future Past timeline. But when she had arrived back in this timeline, well, her mind does not remember anything about her future at all. Just small pieces here and there, and that's it. And so when it comes to Megan, when she asks Rachel, hey, what was your future like? Rachel honestly cannot answer that question for her. Now, when it comes to Rachel, she senses something and she realized there's something big nearby. And so she leaves to head over to that location. But now we jump over to, well, Forge and also Banshee. Around this time in Marvel Comics, the X-Men were technically disbanded, but for a good reason. But you have Forge and Banshee on their way to try to find the different members of the X-Men. But then out of nowhere, they are confronted by the adult Franklin Richards, who apparently remembers them, but only from his timeline. And so he realized that this Forge and this Banshee, they're too young to be his Forge and Banshee. And so he freaks out and leaves just like that. But while you have Franklin Richards just bouncing all over the place, apparently something or someone else had picked up on his energy. And now their goal is to recover him, to find him, and most likely bring him down. Now we jump back over to the Fantastic Four. And now you have our heroes wondering what to do next. Like, what should they do when it comes to Franklin Richards? But the first step is to find him. And then after that, you can try to figure out what to do next. And so you have our heroes try to leave, except when they try to leave, they are confronted by an army of robots. Now, these robots are very similar to Sentinels. And here is the reason why. They were sent there to find Franklin Richards, but the adult one, who is no longer there. but then they detect the other Franklin Richards, our Franklin, who is a child, but who also is a mutant. Around this time in Marvel Comics, Franklin was a mutant. I do know in the present day comics, it all changed. He's no longer a mutant, but back at this time, he was. And so these smaller robots, they go on attack mode for young Franklin because he is a mutant, very similar to a Sentinel. Now, you also had these robots go after Reed and also Susan as well because they are his parents. They're at blame for creating a child that is a mutant. But you do have our heroes being able to use their powers to get rid of all those robots. But then after the battle, you have Banshee and Forge appear. Now, when they appear, they tell the Fantastic Four, hey, just a moment ago, we had a run-in with a Franklin Richards, but he was a grown man. What in the world is going on over here? Now, they see young Franklin. They're like, okay, well, we see your Franklin, he's a boy, but one we saw earlier was a grown man. And so you have the Fantastic Four help Banshee and Forge understand what is exactly happening here. But now their goal is to find Franklin. And so they ask young Franklin, hey, where would you go if you want to hide somewhere? And he says, oh, that easy. The Powers, the home of the Power Pack team. Now, Power Pack was just a group of kids who gained their abilities from an alien, and they were just your regular kids superhero team, go on some crazy wild adventures. But there was a point in time where Franklin was part of that team. He would come and go, and so it made sense that he would be there hiding out with the rest of Power Pack. When it comes to Power Pack, they have no idea that they have been playing with an adult Franklin Richards. What he has done was he used his abilities to alter their minds, to make them believe that they were playing with an younger Franklin Richards, not an adult one. And matter of fact, when it comes to Power Pack's father, he believed that his children were playing with the young Franklin. And so when Fantastic Four arrived, they come back to their senses and realize that they have been playing with an adult version of their friend. Now, you do have our heroes being able to take the adult Franklin and head back home to their base. Except on the way home, you didn't have Franklin freak out once again because he sees a building that to him should not be there at all. And so he disappears once again. And so then you have Forge and Reed being able to create devices that should be able to locate Franklin Richards and to hopefully bring him back over here. And so you have our heroes split up into two groups. One group goes north, one group goes south, and hopefully they can find Franklin very soon. But now we jump over to New Mutants Annual number 6. Now, when it comes to Franklin Richards, we now know where he went to. He went over to the school of Charles Xavier. Now, let's not forget, by this point in Marvel Comics, school is long gone. It was blown up by Mr. Sinister. And so for Franklin, he's kind of like, this is not right. There was a school here. What happened here? What in the world is going on? And so you have Franklin going out of his way to use his abilities to bring the school back to life. Just bam, just like that. Except when he does it, he brings it back to the point where he remembers from his future. And so it honestly does not look like a school, but more like a barrack. But now we have to jump over to the bad guy of the book, and that is going to be Ahab. Now, when it comes to Ahab, he's also from the Days of Future Past timeline. Matter of fact, he was the leader of the Hounds. Now, when it comes to Hounds, they were basically used in the future as a way to hunt down mutants. They were mutants who were acting like wild animals who were sent out to hunt down other mutants. But when it comes to Hounds, their leader was Ahab. But apparently he's here right now in the past trying to find Franklin Richards. And here is the reason why. Because back in the original story for Days of Future Past, Franklin died. And so the question is, if he had died in the future, How in the world is he here right now in the past? Either way, he does send out one of his hounds and a few more robots to hopefully find Franklin. Now, by this point in the Marvel timeline, the New Mutant was still a team, but the New Mutants were now being led by Cable. Now, by this point, we don't know much about Cable, but he is on a mission to stop someone else, better known as Strife. But currently, we see our heroes in the danger room. You see, even though the school was blown up, the sub-basement to the school was kept intact. And so you have the New Mutants use the sub-basement of the school as their new base. And so when we jump over to the New Mutants, we just see them currently just in the danger room doing their thing and having a good old training session. And so once you have the New Mutants being able to wrap up their training session, well, that is when they are confronted by another group of characters. Now, this new group, they're also called the New Mutants, but they're from the Days of Future Past timeline. Franklin Richards once again had changed reality around him to be able to bring his friends into this reality. Now, they're not real, but for him, they are real. And to our heroes, it seems, again, they are actually real. Now, our heroes are wondering what in the world is going on. Now, in this new group, Cypher is part of that group. And remember, in our coverage over the New Mutants, Cypher died in the main Marvel Universe back in Fall of the Mutants, but apparently in Days of Future Past timeline, he's alive. Now, in our timeline, he was bonded with Warlock, but in that timeline, he is not. He is actually bonded to Warlock's father, Magnus, which sometimes can make him a tad bit crazy. But for our heroes, they're kind of wondering, why in the world is this other group right now in their base, in their danger room? But you have the other group say, no, you're in our danger room, you're in our home. And so you have the two sides begin to fight one another. Now, their battle does go on for a few pages, but it does lead back upstairs. And once they get upstairs, they realize that Franklin Richards had brought the school technically back to life, but how it was in his timeline. But also, he brought Banshee from his timeline into this reality as well. Now, this Banshee is very confused when he sees our New Mutants, but especially Cable. And he says, Cable, what are you doing here? Now, our Cable, he has no idea what this Banshee is talking about, but you did have our heroes realize that it has to be Franklin Richards. He's well known across the Marvel universe, and they know that sometimes his powers can go awry, and sometimes when it comes to Franklin, he will warp reality around people and themselves, or bring things to life like he is at this moment. And so you have our heroes say, this is not your timeline. Like, you are trying to change our timeline into your timeline so that it'll seem familiar. But this is not your time at all. And matter of fact, when it comes to Banshee that he brought to life, you have that Banshee say, they're right. You cannot do this. You have to let us go. You have to move on. It's kind of like his own mind telling him what you're doing right now is not correct. But at the same time, he cannot accept the idea that his time is gone and he's somewhere else in the timeline. And so he begins to cry after letting everything go back to normal. Now, after you have Franklin Richards disappear once again, you then have Reed Richards, Susan, and also Banshee arrive at the school because they're one of the two groups in the last chapter who are trying to find Franklin Richards. And so when they arrive at the school, they realize that they're too late, but then they are able to catch the New Mutants up to explain what is exactly going on here when it comes to this adult Franklin Richards. But while you have our heroes talking to one another, that is the moment they get attacked by another group of robots being led by another hound. And so this hound and the robots begin to attack our heroes. Now, this battle does not last that long. Matter of fact, you do have our heroes being able to take down all the robots very easily. But when it comes to the hound, he is able to get his hands on the young Franklin Richards. But luckily, you have Richter use his ability to shoot the Hound out of the sky. And it was a huge crash to the ground for the Hound, to the point where he's on the verge of dying. But before he does die, he talks to Richter. Now, when it comes to this Hound, he actually does talk to Richter and says, listen, the reason why I was sent here is because of my master Ahab. We are trying to go after Franklin Richards because that man has the ability to change history. And if he does, it could change our future as well. And so we came back here to protect our future. Really, I came here because I'm being forced to come here by my master. You see, I'm a hound, and hounds are trained by Ahab to be savages, to be used to chase after our own kind. Now, after you have Richter learn all those different things about hounds and why they're here for and who their master, you have Ahab appear to go ahead and silence his hound to make sure that he's not able to share any more kind of information. Now, when it comes to Franklin, we see that he went over to a museum, and apparently in his timeline, this was a fun place for him. But once again, he does change reality around him, where this time he creates a version of Rachel Summers. Because remember, in his timeline, those two characters, they were in love with one another. And so now he had created a younger version of her, being able to spend some time with her. Now, while you have these two supposed characters talking to one another, a sentinel appears. Now, when the Sentinels try to attack Franklin, none of their attacks are actually working. You see, all the attacks are just going through him. But on top of that, when it comes to Franklin, he does not notice that he's being attacked because all those attacks are not being able to hit him. And so while you had the Sentinels and also the Hounds trying their best to attack Franklin, you then have Reed, Sue, and the New Mutants arrive. Now, when they arrive, they tried their best to help out Franklin. And so a battle does happen for a few pages. But then at the tail end of the battle, you then have one of the Hounds fly completely through Franklin, like he was some kind of hologram. But once that Hound had flown through him, that is the moment he takes notice that there is a battle happening around him involving the New Mutants, Reed and Sue. And so you then have Franklin use his abilities to get rid of all the Sentinels, to get rid of all the Hounds. Now, when I say get rid of them, I don't mean like, okay, he sent them away and it's all good and done. No, he had destroyed the robots completely. He had killed off those Hounds. Now, when he kills off the Hounds, the young Franklin is now scared of himself. He's afraid of the idea of becoming this adult version who has gone crazy. Now, when it comes to adult Franklin, he says, listen, to make sure that my time does not happen, I have to get rid of my younger self's powers. If I do that, that means that my future will not happen at all. And so you have the adult version of Franklin Richards being able to take away the powers of the young Franklin Richards to make sure the days of future past does not happen at all. But now we jump over to X Factor Annual number 5 for the third chapter of Days of Future Present, where we pick up with Franklin Richards once again. And you have him walking over to the ship that belongs to X Factor. And he says, that place right there isn't right. But now we have to jump over to X Factor. Now, when it comes to X Factor, they are the original X-Men who were brought back together as a new team once Jean Grey was found at the bottom of the bay by the Fantastic Four, where we had learned that she was never the Phoenix in the first place. But when it comes to X Factor, they're currently having a training session / fun game as well. But here's the problem though. You have Cyclops getting very upset with how Jean Grey is playing playing the game because he believes that she's going a tad bit too far with the game to the point where he's afraid that somebody might get hurt. And it actually does lead into a small argument between the two of them. But why you have the two arguing? Well, out of nowhere, their base, better known as the ship, automatically disappears completely. Now, of course, this leads into our heroes free falling. So you do have our heroes try their best to save each other, but to also save the son of Cyclops, better known as Christopher Summers, or Christopher Nathaniel Summers. Either way, you do have our heroes being able to save themselves, and now they're wondering what exactly happened to their ship. Now, they have no idea that it was actually Franklin Richards, because Franklin realized that ship does not belong in the skyline of New York, because in his time, there was no ship, and so he went out of his way to get rid of it. But now we have to jump over to Arab. Now, when it comes to Arab, he's currently wondering how in the world Franklin Richards is here. Now, for him, he remembered that Franklin had no powers, but on top of that, Franklin had died by his hands. And so he is very confused how, one, Franklin's alive again, and two, how Franklin also has powers as well. But either way, you didn't have Arab say, you know what, I'll just send more hounds after him. But then one of the hounds does not want to chase after Franklin. And the reason why? Because Franklin brings hope. Any idea that their future could possibly be changed. And so you had a hound tell Arab, no, I will not help you hunt down that man at all. But now we jump over to the Human Torch, Ben Grimm, She-Think, or Miss Marvel, and also Forge, the other group that went south when it came to trying to find Franklin Richards. Now, they were able to pick up on his powers when he used it to remove the ship of the X-Factor team. And so when our heroes arrive at location, all they see is, well, X-Factor. And you have our heroes tell the Fantastic Four and Forge like, hey, our ship had just magically disappeared and we have no idea how. And so you have our other heroes tell X-Factor this is the reason why. Franklin Richards. And so you have Cyclops and X-Factor agree to help out the Fantastic Four and Forge to figure out what in the world is going on when it comes to Franklin Richards. And so after their agreement to work together, you then have our heroes head over to what could be the next location of where Franklin is at. Except when they do arrive at that location, well, out of nowhere, they have a bolt of fire just fly by them. And of course, that is the Phoenix. And we saw back in the first chapter that she had detected the powers of Franklin Richards. But here's the problem though. You see, first, she has no idea who he is, because like I said earlier, she does not remember anything about her timeline at this moment. But two, she also knows that Franklin is beginning to take away her powers of the Phoenix, that somehow he's able to absorb her abilities. Now, you do have the rest of the heroes arrive, one we saw earlier in this chapter. But the one character I want to focus on is Jean Grey. And here is the reason why. This is her first time meeting Rachel Summers. Now, before we are able to talk more about this actual meeting, I want to bring up two more things. The first is that Arab has sent over more robots to actually attack our heroes, to go after Franklin Richards. But in the middle of that, you have Franklin freaking out, because when he sees Rachel Summers as the Phoenix, he remembers that she was not the Phoenix back in their timeline. And so for him, it's kind of like, what is wrong with you? How are you able to do that? You should not be able to do that at all. And so seeing the woman he loves being different, it bothers him. And he wants to take things back to normal. Take her back the way she was before she had left their timeline, before she became the Phoenix. And so because of that trauma of seeing her different, but also things in prior chapter, once again, he releases a huge amount of energy, getting rid of all those robots, but also depowering the Phoenix for the time being. sending Rachel down to the ground. Now, when it comes to Jean Grey, she wants to make sure that Rachel is okay, except when she goes down there, you have Rachel say, "Oh, well, I guess it's time for you to know that I'm your daughter from an alternate timeline." And Jean Grey and Cyclops had no idea that Rachel was their daughter. Now, Cyclops, he knew about Rachel for a while, but Jean Grey, this is her first meeting, and she goes to find out that this is her daughter from an alternate timeline. Now, you do have some of the other characters go out of their way to find Franklin. And when they do, well, that is the moment they get attacked by some more Sentinels. Now, they're really after Franklin, but like we saw earlier, when it comes to Franklin, he has no idea that they are there. And really, when they try to attack him, well, he's basically unharmed by their attacks. And so once you have our heroes being able to deal with them and they disappear, that's when you have Franklin get up and he just leaves once again. But now we have to get back over to the meeting between Jean Grey and Rachel Summers. And this meeting is really important because, like I said earlier, this is their first time meeting each other, but also this is Jean Grey finding out that Rachel is her daughter from some alternate timeline. Now you have Cyclops come back as well. And so at this moment, he finds out that Rachel is his daughter. Now he knew about Rachel, like she's been around for a while. She was part of the X-Men, but he had no idea that she was his daughter. Now she does tell Jean Grey and Cyclops that her timeline, there was no Nathan. There was no Christopher at all. She was the only child, their only child. Now for Jean Grey, she cannot accept the idea that Rachel Summers is her daughter. Now, there is a reason, and I really can't say it's good or bad, but once we do sit down and talk about it, you'll kind of decide for yourself. Now, in the middle of their conversation, they're then attacked once again by Ahab. Now, he brought a whole army with him to go after our heroes. But first, he goes after Rachel Summers. Because, like I said, in the past, not in the past, like her timeline, she was actually a hound. And so he had control over her for a good period of time. Now she was able to break free, but as soon as he appears, he is able to recapture her mind, to make her a hound once again. Now she's able to break free by using the powers of the Phoenix. And when she does, she's kind of like, okay, you know what? I cannot sit here or stand here and have you guys judge me on how I was acting just a moment ago, because you don't understand what I was in my own timeline, that I was a hound. But also she can tell that Jean Grey is not going to accept her. And so you have Rachel just leave. Now, after she leaves, Ahab is all like, listen, she's gone. But right now, I have to get rid of you guys because right now you're also helping to protect Franklin, my other target. And so you have Ahab sent out an army to attack our heroes. And so while you have our heroes battling against Ahab, you didn't have Cyclops realize that there's something going on in the middle of the sky. Every single time his optic blast would shoot up in the air, it would stop midpoint in the air, and he has no idea why. And so you didn't have our heroes realize that it has to be something going on with Ahab. And so he pulls Reed over, and you have Reed and Cyclops both realize that when it comes to Ahab, his base that he has been working out of is currently hiding in some kind of pocket dimension, sitting outside of time and space. And so you have our heroes believe that if they are able to get rid of that base, then most likely he'll have to go back to his time. Now, luckily for our heroes, the rest of their team arrive. The New Mutants, the rest of the Fantastic Four, and also you have Banshee as well. And so while you have both parties being able to work together to fight against Ahab, you have the Human Torch and Iceman being able to do enough damage to destroy the ship that belongs to Ahab. And once the ship is gone, all his creatures, including him, disappear just like that. And so at first we're left to believe that most likely they were sent back to their time. But then you have our heroes having the chance to finally take a breather. You think that Cyclops and Rachel are going to have the ability to actually talk about Rachel Summers, except that is the moment you have Franklin reappear. Now, when he does, he says, listen, this timeline's not right. In my time, you guys never had a son. You only had a daughter. That's the person who should be here right now, the woman I love. And so you have Franklin once again trying to change his world into his own world by getting rid of Christopher. He disappears in the arms of Cyclops, and then Franklin disappears. And we're left to wonder what exactly happened to Nathan, or Christopher for some of y'all out there. But now we jump into the final chapter for today's video, where we actually pick up with Rachel Summers. Now we see Rachel just enjoying a meal, a good old burger at a diner, and she remembers that in her timeline, she couldn't do this at all. But while trying to enjoy this nice burger, you didn't have three guys try to rob the place. Now you do have Rachel being able to use her abilities to stop the guys, but while doing that, she sees somebody watching her, and she remembers who it is. It's Franklin Richards. Now, when she goes outside, he's no longer there, and so she's wondering where in the world he went to. And so you have Rachel Summers release a mental cry. Now, this mental cry is heard across the world, and we do see different characters of the Marvel Universe hearing this mental cry. But after doing it, she's then confronted by Franklin Richards, and now she remembers who he is. But here's the problem. Like I said earlier, Franklin Richards died in the original timeline for Days of Future Past. And so for her, she's kind of wondering, why in the world is he here? If he is here, could this be a trap? Can she actually trust him? And he says, scan my mind, which she does. And when she does scan his mind, she becomes to find out that it is Franklin. And you have the two share a kiss, because again, these two used to date back in the original timeline for these characters. But after you had Rachel and Franklin be able to share that kiss, they head over to the base of the Fantastic Four to inform the X-Men, X-Factor, and Fantastic Four that these two characters are going to try to build a new life together somewhere. But here's the problem though, guys. You see, when it comes to Reed and Sue, they have some concerns. Like, one, where is Nathan Summers? Two, where is the X-Factor ship? And three, what about their Franklin? Because the young Franklin is currently in a coma, and he was in that coma ever since the adult Franklin had took away his abilities. But then you have the adult Franklin use his abilities to change the mindset of Reed and Sue, where they are no longer worried about anything they just mentioned earlier. Instead of kind of like, you know what? This is a celebration. It's really great that you and Rachel will be able to spend some time together. And then you have Franklin and Rachel leave. Now, as soon as they leave, Reed and Sue, their minds go back to normal, which tells them that Franklin was using his abilities. And so you have all the heroes realize that they have to come together one more time and try to figure out what to do with Franklin to get everything back to normal. But now we pick up with Storm and Gambit. Now, around this time in Marvel Comics, Storm was a child, and let me explain why. So, in an earlier story arc that we had covered, you had the X-Men fight against the Nanny and also Orphan Maker. Now, at the end of that battle, we were left to believe that Storm had died, but of course she did not. Instead, she was kidnapped by the Nanny because the Nanny wanted to have Storm under her control, kind of like a child under her control. But she realized Storm's willpower was just too strong because she was a grown woman. And so you had the Nanny use a device to de-age Storm down back into a young girl so that she could use her powers on Storm to control her. But Storm was able to get away. But after doing that, she basically been hanging out with Gambit this entire time. And so you have the two characters heading over to the sub-basement of Charles Xavier School to kind of begin the process of finding the X-Men, her team. She has no idea what happened to them after she had supposedly died, except when she gets to that sub-basement, well, she runs into Cable in the New Mutants. Now for Storm, she has been gone for really a short period of time in comics, but she has missed a lot. The idea the X-Men are no longer around. You now have the Muir Island X-Men. You now have Cable in charge of the New Mutants. Like, she has missed a lot, but she was only gone for a short period of time. There was a huge shuffle in teams, but you didn't have Cable and also Forge being able to catch her up. But also when it comes to Franklin Richards. But once she hears about Franklin Richards, she's kind of like, he should not be around. And here is the reason why. Storm knows that Franklin died in the future. The rest of the heroes, they never knew that. But now we have to jump over to Cyclops and also Susan Storm, where you have the two characters having a conversation about Jean Grey. Now, like I said earlier, Jean Grey has a reason of why she does not like Rachel Summers. But I did say that I cannot tell you if it's a good or a bad reason. It's completely up to you guys. And here is the reason why. So when it comes to Jean Grey, she hates the idea that the future is technically set for her. That she believes no matter what in the future, she's going to have to marry Cyclops and have a daughter. And for her, that's not fair. Because around this time in Marvel Comics, she's also trying to deal with the idea that there are three different personas in her mind at this moment. You have her, you have Madeline Pryor from X-Men Inferno, and you also have the Phoenix. You have all three different personalities currently battling in her mind. And so for her, she's having a hard time trying to figure out when she does like something, is it her or is it Madeline? Or is it the Phoenix? And so when it comes to Cyclops, she has no idea if it's her that actually loves him or is it Madeline or the Phoenix. And so she hates the idea that she feels like she has no free will. And so finding out that in the future that you get married to Cyclops and also have a daughter, it feels like, again, she has no say in what comes for her life. And so you have Cyclops wondering, why is Jean Grey acting like that? And you have Susan try her best to explain things to him. But then out of nowhere, both characters are attacked by Ahab, who had just randomly returned and grabs our two heroes and disappears. Now you have the rest of the heroes meet up, where you have Storm explain the whole entire timeline to Days of Future Past to the rest of the heroes, because all the other characters besides her were not there when Days of Future Past actually happened. And so you have Storm say, listen, I was told by the future Kitty Pryde and Rachel that Franklin Richard died. He died in that timeline. And so it makes no sense on how in the world he's here right now in the present day. Now you also have our heroes wondering, is Storm saying that she believed that her and the rest of her X-Men had worked alongside with future Kitty Pryde and Rachel to make sure that timeline did not happen? Then why do all these different characters keep appearing? It seems like that timeline is still going to happen. And so now you have our heroes kind of wondering, what is exactly going on with Franklin Richards? But they do know one thing. They have to find him, but to also save Rachel from him, because they realize that Franklin is doing something to her as well. Now, getting back over to Ahab, we kind of find out that he has turned Cyclops and Susan Storm into, or Susan Richards, into, well, hounds as well. And remember, hounds in his timeline were used to hunt down other mutants. And so once you have Cyclops and Susan become hounds, he says, listen, I need you guys to go ahead and find your children. I want to find Rachel and also Franklin. Now, when it comes to Susan, she's able to locate both of her kids. Now, the problem is Well, not really a problem. Is that Ahab only wants one of them. He wants the adult one, not the young one. Now, when it comes to Cyclops, he tells Ahab, I cannot locate Rachel for you at all. Now, for Ahab, he realized that Cyclops is not lying, but he does know that Franklin and Rachel are in love. If you find one, you'll find the other. And so you have Ahab use Susan as his hound to locate Franklin and Rachel Summers. And so now we jump over to Franklin and Rachel, who are having a picnic, just minding their business, but they have a baby with them. Now, this baby is, of course, Nathan Summers. So now we know that he is perfectly okay. But for Franklin, he's wondering, why is Rachel so okay with the past being different than it was in their timeline? Because like I said earlier, in their timeline, there was no Nathan Summers. But she says miracles can happen. Maybe when we went back in time the first time, we did change the past. And yes, our future could still happen, but now our future could involve him and also me, siblings together. But for Franklin, that's not right at all. That in his time, in their time, there was no Nathan. Now, while you have the two talking to one another, that is when you have Ahab appear. And when he does appear, he is able to use his own powers to take down both Franklin and Rachel Summers. And so now they are his prisoners. Now, with Rachel Summers and also Franklin Richards being prisoners for Ahab, you didn't have the rest of the heroes arrive. X-Factor, X-Men, the New Mutants, and also the Fantastic Four. Everyone is there to work together to bring down this one character. Now, the battle is really short-lived because you have Ahab being able to use some kind of device to take all our heroes out at once. Now, when it comes to Storm, she is able to make it over to Franklin Richards to wake him up. And as soon as she does, he realizes what he has to do. So when it comes to Franklin, he gets rid of all machines that belong to Ahab. Those machines were giving him the ability to stay in this reality. And so with those machines gone, he has no choice but to go back to his own reality. Now, before he leaves, he tries to take Rachel Summers with him, but she says no. Now, after getting that answer, he tries to kill her off, but luckily Jean Grey protects Rachel Summers. Now, before he leaves, he says one last line. He says, I know how the war ends. Whatever you do to me now, you'll still meet me in the days to come. And then he leaves back into his own time. But now it's time for us to get the answers on what in the world is going on when it comes to Franklin Richards. Now, when it comes to Storm, she realized that this is a ghost. Let me explain. So like I said earlier, the adult Franklin, he did die in the original story, Days of Future Past. He died in that book, except apparently when he did die, he was able to send a shadow version of himself back in time where he felt the most safe. And apparently that was when he was a child. And so the shadow version of himself right now is basically a ghost of Franklin Richards from the future that had traveled back in time and had automatically connected to the present day Franklin. And he has been using the powers of present day Franklin to stay around, but to also change reality around him to what he remembered from his timeline. And so as long as he stays here, the young Franklin, our Franklin, will not be able to wake up from his coma. But at the same time, he's also been holding on to the powers of the Phoenix as well. And so you have the hero saying, you're just a ghost. Like, you're not the real Franklin from that time. Like, you need to go away to allow our Franklin the chance to survive, but to also give the power of the Phoenix back over to Rachel Summers. And so he has no choice but to say goodbye, which he does, but you can tell that it hurts Rachel a lot. But she is able to regain the abilities of the Phoenix, but also young Franklin, he now is out of his coma and he's back to normal. Now, the same power that was released from the adult Franklin also turned Cyclops and Susan back into their regular forms. They're no longer hounds anymore. Now, when it comes to Rachel, she does change back into her hound outfit she wore back in the present day of her timeline, or really what she wears sometimes here and there in Marvel Comics. But when she does show this form off, you have Jean Grey kind of freak out to see how Rachel looks, but also Rachel is embarrassed on how she's looking right now, because when she was a hound, she did a lot of horrible things, and she hates the idea of seeing her mom being kind of judgmental towards how she looks. And so you have Rachel leave, and no one really stops her. Now, the book kind of ends on the idea of the teens going their separate ways, but you do have X Factor telling Storm and Forge and Banshee that they're going to help them find the rest of the X-Men to reform the team. And so this leads us into the next era for X-Men comics, which then leads us into the next crossover that we are going to talk about very soon on this channel. But this is where we are going to end today's comic book video. So please leave me a like down below and subscribe. But guys, see y'all next time. Later.